let's just ask Fatima, Sister Fatima. Let's get deeply into the root of the question. Does Islam need feminism? Sister Fatima.
Yes, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brother and panelists. The question, does Islam need feminism? I would look at it from this perspective. First of all, we know that Islam, we know that we have a creator. We believe in our creator. We believe that he sent us guidance through the prophets and then through the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If we believe that we have a creator and we believe that the creator sent us guidance, then that guidance that he sent us is comprehensive guidance, as the Quran itself tells us, that Al-yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum, Allah says, today I have completed for you your religion, or the way of life that I have approved for you. So since Islam is a complete and comprehensive way of life, and the last message sent to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our creator, through the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we would expect it to be complete. We know that it is, but I mean that even just from that perspective, we would expect, yes, the way of life is complete. The answers to the problems that human beings have can best be given by their creator. And so everything that we need as human beings, male and female, to live a good life, to be happy in this life, to be successful in the comprehensive sense of the word, meaning in this life and in the next, to cater for not just our physical needs, because we know that we aren't just physical beings, but also for our spiritual, our ruh, our souls. We would expect the way of life.
I think we may have lost Fatima. Still with us, right? Okay. Yes.
We would expect that way of life to fulfill that. So, as a Muslim, I believe Islam doesn't need any external kind of ism or schism to come in and fix it, so to speak. If anything, if we were to return and to practice and to observe the way of life revealed to us by our Creator properly, it would solve and cater for all of our needs.
Okay. Interesting. Sister Zara, just get your perspective on this. Before we go into the depths of feminism, what exactly is feminism? And surely it's not a good, is it a good thing or is it not a good thing to demand women's rights?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to everybody who's joined today. Thank you for inviting me here, and thank you to everybody who's joined us as well. I think this question often arises for one key reason, the issue on feminism and whether it's either compatible with Islam or whether it's helpful to Muslims. And that is because we often conflate women's rights with feminism, and we treat them as though they're the same thing. We treat women's rights and feminism as though they are synonymous. And the reality is that they're not synonymous. And there's a couple of reasons why, which I'd like to go into and share with you today. Feminism, the best way to understand its place in society. Feminism is to women's rights what capitalism or communism is to economics. So economics, for example, is resource distribution. It's about how we distribute wealth and how we distribute all kinds of material resources. And capitalism and communism have their own ideologies on resource distribution, but they are in of themselves not economics. So capitalism is not economics, communism is not economics. They're merely different worldviews to the question of resource distribution. Now, similarly, feminism is just one approach to the issue of women's rights, and Islam is another approach to the issue of women's rights. Hopefully you start to see where I'm going with this. Now, in its most generic terms possible, per your question, feminism is often described by most people as, generally the equality of men and women. And I don't think anybody here would disagree with the sentiment behind that. And it's not the fact that when somebody is criticizing or questioning feminism that they're, questioning the idea that, there shouldn't be any kind of oppression between men and women. They're separate things. So feminism and Islam's approach to women's rights, as has been sort of touched upon briefly by Sister Fatima already, they have very little in common with one another. Other than this very broad notion of, not wanting to oppress women, for example. That's the broadest, I suppose, you could take it. But beyond that general platitude, we see that with feminism, for example, it's based on the notion of individualism, which is contrary to the underlying notion of Islam or being a Muslim, which is in individualism, the individual or the individual person or the self is more important than society, culture, religion, or even God. And as a result, for feminism or for feminists, again, which is just one approach to women's rights, for feminists, they often will be the ones trying to define what those women's rights should be. Feminists will often be the ones trying to define what women's roles should be. And because of the very diverse and fractured nature of feminism itself, that often results in a lot of disagreement amongst even feminists as to what those rights should look like and how to attain them. So it's basically a big game of trial and error, and nobody's really certain among feminists about what the end goal ought to look like. Whereas on the other hand, Islam as an approach to the issue of women's rights, it's a worldview that isn't centered on the individual, but rather it's centered on the creator. So as Sister Fatima mentioned, for us it's about the creator. It's not about individuals' personal ideas, but it's about what did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordain for us as to how society should work. For us, God is the arbiter of that, and the Quran and the Sunnah provide for us the method to establish that. So the question comes down to that sort of terminology, to the methodology and how we define those goals, rather than merely the sentiment behind it. And one final point on this that I think is really useful to know going into this discussion. A lot of people use the term feminism for a couple of different reasons. So sometimes sisters will use it, I would say innocently, because for them they may, as I said, use it to mean women's rights. But for the reasons mentioned above, we should be careful of interchanging those terms because they're not the same thing. On the other hand, however, there are some who might use it thinking that the term feminism or, the label feminist or the language of feminism carries with it some social weight. And sometimes people use it thinking it carries more influential social weight than using the term Islam or Muslim. And oftentimes there may be groups or individuals who use the term thinking that they can enlist either help or sympathy from outside their community, and often, whether willing or not, against their own community. And of course, that comes with its own strings attached, which we can go into later. But that's one of the problems with it. And the other problem is that sometimes the term feminism is used by Muslims occasionally also to broadcast a kind of rejection of their own culture. And I'll end this question with this point, which is that a lot of the problems that we are facing, particularly in terms of the rights of either women or men in our society, it is not, as we know, because of Islam, but the absence of Islam. And often it's because of the cultures that we allow to persist in our communities. And the question that we need to ask, when people want to advocate change, who are we addressing? So when Muslims want to advocate change for women, sometimes we hear the fact that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, whenever he was approached by a woman who had a complaint or a grievance or an issue, that he would listen. And so we should also listen when women have complaints. Yes, we should listen. However, the question is, who has the ability to change the status quo at the moment? Who are we addressing with these concerns? And at the moment, sometimes we have sisters that use the term feminism, and they go to those that have what little authority they do have, which isn't much. They may go to, you know, certain individuals in the community, and using feminist language or using the term feminism, they are essentially alienating their own allies. They are alienating the very people who may actually agree with you know, the fact that these grievances are genuine. They may agree, and they most probably do. But the problem is, when we couch our issues or our complaints in the language of feminism, we are putting on the back that people who quite rightly associate feminism with a foreign ideology that has, you know, and as I'm sure we'll go into later, caused a lot of harm and a lot of damage throughout, you know, to Muslim communities throughout history. And so the language and the use of the term feminism is often met with, you know, an understandable backlash. Now, if we just used different words, so describing behavior that is non-Islamic, so where, for example, a woman is being denied, you know, her right as a Muslim woman, if we describe that as, this is because of Jahiliyyah, this is because this is un-Islamic, nobody is going to disagree with them. Nobody is going to say, oh no, Jahiliyyah can be a good thing. Nobody is going to say that. But when we say, you know, this is, you know, this is, and there's all kinds of manners of terminology that we can get into, but a lot of language that is associated with feminism, we're alienating the very people who, one, would be our allies in changing this and establishing a kind of more accountability in society. We're alienating them, and we are also, you know, we are not doing justice to what Islam is as a religion, which is a holistic approach to dealing with these issues. And instead, we are bringing in alternative worldviews that actually muddy the situation rather than clarify them. So hopefully it's quite a lot there, but hopefully that's, you know, a good place to initiate some of these questions this evening, inshallah.
Okay, sorry, Danielle. Just the issue related to, I noticed that one of the articles that you wrote on your website was about relating the war on terror to Islam and feminism. Do you think, give us a bit of an insight into what's all that, what the war on terror to Islam and feminism is all about?
Absolutely. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillah. So just to preface the question on the war on terror, let me just make clear that I consider myself to be an anti-feminist. And the reason is that I believe that feminism is a very corrosive and destructive ideology. I think what Sister Zara and Fatima have said is absolutely true, that Islam and feminism are separate and in many ways not compatible. But I go even further to say that feminism is anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim. And the fact of the matter is that feminism is one of the most influential ideologies that's negatively impacting the faith of Muslims around the world, and has been used to attack Muslims and continues to be used to attack Muslim societies and Islam. And I think that, as has been mentioned already, the reason that some Muslims find feminism attractive is because they see that Islam and feminism overlap, or seemingly overlap, in some areas. Feminism advocates respect for women, and Islam advocates respect for women. Feminism advocates for women's rights in some sense, and Islam advocates for women's rights, depending on what those rights are and whether they're legitimate or not. So there are these overlaps, but we can't ignore all the areas where feminism is contrary to Islam and is in fact anathema to Islam. And I think there are three main areas that we have to focus on. And I'm going to touch on these three areas probably more than once in the course of this webinar. But number one, the central pillar of feminism is this idea of patriarchy. Namely, this idea that all of history, since the dawn of time, men have been working together in a sort of conspiracy to subjugate women for their own benefit. And that there are these patriarchal structures of power that systematically favor men over women. And you can internalize patriarchy, and patriarchy affects our language and our systems of thought. And so, but this idea of patriarchy is highly problematic to Islam, because our Prophet, peace be upon him, was a man. All the Khulafa Rashidun were men. All the major schools of thought were founded by men. All the major works of tafsir, of kalam, of fiqh, and so on and so forth, these were all primarily done by men, which is not to say that there weren't any female scholars in our tradition. There certainly were, but the vast majority were men. So this is seen as a big problem according to the feminist philosophy, and many Muslim feminists have a major issue and a problem with the Islamic tradition for precisely this reason. And the fact that that Islamic scholarship is dominated by men means that we have to be suspicious of Islamic scholarship and the Islamic tradition as far as feminism is concerned. So these feminists attack, okay, and they try to undermine the Islamic tradition. They attack the Quran. You have Muslim feminists, not all Muslim feminists, but you have some who will attack the Quran and will say we have to say no to the Quran, right? And that's a direct quote from one of the most prominent Muslim feminists, that in some cases, in some contexts, it is appropriate to say no to the Quran. And you have Muslim feminists who are attacking the Anbiya, the prophets. You have so many Muslim feminists who are attacking all aspects of Islamic law, the Sharia, and all aspects of fiqh and the tradition as a whole. So this idea of patriarchy is very, very corrosive to Islam and to Muslim society. So that's one. The second thing is that feminism also attacks the family and attacks the home. And Islam is a religion that really, really emphasizes the importance of family and the importance of the home. The home is the central hub of a Muslim's life. And the family, the extended family, is the central institution of a Muslim's life and of Muslim society. But in the modern world, that's no longer the case, unfortunately. And that's in large part because of feminism and how feminism has attacked the family. But, you know, I hopefully don't need to emphasize how important family is in Islam, how often Allah mentions in the Quran, and the Prophet ﷺ has mentioned maintaining ties of kinship, silat al-rahim, how we are told to respect and honor our parents, how we're supposed to respect and honor our mothers, especially, and our fathers. But these are institutions that feminism attacks, sometimes in very overt ways and sometimes in much more subtle ways. Feminists call motherhood bondage, especially in the first wave of feminism and the second wave of feminism and now in the third wave. Motherhood is seen as a big problem. Fatherhood, the father is a patriarch. Father should be seen with suspicion, right? Parents need to be wary of even having children, which is why birth control and abortion are so emphasized within feminist discourse, because children are a burden. And children also should be wary of their parents, especially their fathers. So all of this is attacking the family and the institution of the family, which is so important within Islam. And so we can see a very direct clash, and we can see the effects of this in the Muslim world. So that's the second thing about feminism. And the third thing is that feminism has been used as a tool against Muslim society in the past and in the present, in terms of colonialism, and even today in terms of programs that are being exported into the Muslim world in order to re-educate Muslims, you know, quote unquote, re-educate them and to influence the way that Muslims form their families and the way that society is structured. So feminism has been used as a tool to further colonialism, to further occupation, to justify invasions, to justify wars against Muslims for over 100 years. And so we have to be aware of that reality. We have to be aware of that history and how it's being continued even up to this day. So given these 3 points, it's very clear how feminism is anti-Muslim, it is anti-Islam, and we need to be very aware of this and not just have this naive view that, okay, feminism is something that can be accommodated, even though, as I mentioned at the beginning, and Sister Zara also mentioned, that there are some areas of overlap. But does that overlap mean that we should just accept the concept wholesale? Islam overlaps with many other ideologies like communism that was mentioned, or other ideologies that are anti-Islam. So we have to be aware of this.
Just going back to the subject regarding the impact of feminism on Muslims just generally, even within the Muslim world. Let's just go back to Europe and let's look at the roots of feminism in Europe. Sister Fatima, you claim that there's a historic source of feminism in Europe due to oppression of women by the Christian church. Do you want to give us a bit of an understanding around that particular subject area?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could say that, you know, because there have been different stages and shades of feminism throughout history, you know, there will have been many different things that contributed to feminism, you know, and feminist ideology. However, one of the things that I found that seemed very, very clear to me when I was researching this subject was just as atheism and secularism came about very much, you know, due to the oppression of the Christian church in Europe, you know, over time. I believe that feminism also finds its roots in the oppression that was meted out by the Christian church in Europe. I mean, one of the very shocking kind of things that you can find out about is the witch hunts that took place during the 15th to 17th century that were sanctioned by the Catholic Church all over Europe, including America as well, where, you know, women, predominantly women, 85% of people accused of being witches. And by the way, being a witch it was a very arbitrary term, you know, you could be accused of being a witch or a devil worshipper for any kind of weird behavior that people saw in you and reported from you. It's estimated between 40,000 and 100,000 women were killed in Europe due to these witch hunts, right? And there were no trials, you know, the women were thrown into rivers and literally burnt at the stake. And this was sanctioned by the church. Also, going right back, if we look at the fact that, you know, women didn't really have access to the Bible. Men didn't have access to the Bible either, you know, the average man on the street. But women especially were not encouraged or not allowed to learn the Bible. You know, the whole story in the Bible of Satan, or Shaitan, you know, and Adam and Eve and Hawa in the garden blames Eve as the primary reason or the primary source or person responsible for the downfall of man. And that's very clear in the Bible. In Genesis 3, Adam blames Eve, and God tells Eve that all the pain and you know, any difficulty that she has in life, especially during childbirth, are due to the sin of Eve, right? And again, celibacy, so in other words, staying away from women, especially, was seen as being the peak of piety for a man, right? So these things and other, you know, forms of oppression, certain basic rights not being given to women, like the right to property, the right to their own legal identity, things that Muslims were not an issue, you know, things that Islam gave women, were big problems for women in the West and especially in Europe. And I believe that this kind of oppression and long-term oppression led to, you know, the beginnings of women, you know, formulating, you know, the first waves of feminism. So that's the background that I was referring to.
Okay. So when we look at the concept of oppression in early sort of history of Europe, when it comes to women, somebody can present the same kind of argument about Muslim communities and the Muslim world, and there is a sense of oppression of women in the Muslim world. Now, surely women and girls should live with respect, kindness, love, support, and the full measure of rights all people deserve. So, Danielle, is this happening in the Muslim community, in the Muslim world? Is there such thing as female oppression, and how should women stand up to this?
Well, I think we have to look at where this question is coming from and the context in which it's being articulated. I would, with all due respect, push back on some of what Sister Fatima has mentioned about the treatment of women in European society. When we look at something like witchcraft, for example, there were also more men who were accused and convicted of practicing magic. Okay, so this is not something that specifically affected women to the exclusion of men. Men were also seen as possibly practicing dark arts and magic, and were also convicted of this within medieval Europe and even in Muslim societies as well. And the problem that I have, and I mentioned this idea of patriarchy, the problem I have with the thesis that when we look at historically, there's been systematic mistreatment of women by men. This is a very problematic thesis, and I don't think actual historical fact justifies that thesis, because many of the examples that are cited are very selective. And this is not to say that women have been treated perfectly at all times and places, not at all. Certainly there is abuse of women and taking of their rights, but it's not something that is specific to that gender. There's also the mistreatment of men. There's also the taking of men's rights in different scenarios and contexts. And I can talk about this for hours, but just to make it more succinct, is feminism gives us this very this specific lens in which to understand and very selectively look at practices in the world and focus on the plight of women to the exclusion of men. And the other point that I often mention is that this idea that women have systematically been oppressed since the dawn of time is very insulting to women, because it says that women have not been able to match wits with men. Women have not been able throughout thousands of years to understand that, oh, we are the victims of this systematic subjugation and we're being taken advantage of, we're being abused, and we haven't even realized this, let alone overturn those systems of oppression. And only within the past 100 years have women realized that this patriarchy, this systematic oppression exists, and only within this modern period have we discovered this grand conspiracy to subjugate women. So this is a very problematic thesis. It has great negative implications for all organized religion, and in fact, first wave feminists from the very beginning had their target on religion, to attack religion, and especially Christianity, especially Islam. So we have to be aware of this and not buy into ideas and perspectives that don't have a basis in reality and are contrary to our religion.
But I think, if I may, Dr. Rafaqat, yes, I just wanted to make the point that what I'm trying to highlight is that as Muslims, we have to realize that feminism emerged in Europe because of historical reasons as well. You know, we can't deny the fact that there were specific historical things that were happening in Europe. So, for example, even just take the world wars, right? And the fact that millions of men were dead and now women were needed for the workforce, right? These factors do add up to explain to us somewhat you know, why it was that feminism emerged in Europe, and why Muslims never felt the need for feminism, because, you know, the rights that were denied women in Europe were already given to Muslim women, many of them. And, you know, Muslim women on the whole did not have this kind of reaction. So I don't think it's necessarily buying into the narrative to say that there were certain specific historical things that were happening in Europe that we as Muslims need to realize, you know, feminism was kind of a reaction to. I don't think there's anything kind of conspiratorial in highlighting that.
Well, I absolutely agree with you that there were historical factors within Europe that led to the rise of feminism. Where we see historically the first mention of women's rights and the mistreatment of women was by European colonizers. We see the first people who are really raising the issue of women's rights, women's education, women's dress are actually white colonialists like John Stuart Mill or Hobbes or Condorcet or Montesquieu or Voltaire. These were really the first feminists, and they were raising these issues of women's rights to attack indigenous societies, including Muslim societies. They're using this as a justification to colonize and to civilize the Muslim world, because the Muslims are so backwards. The Muslims are mistreating their women. The Muslims are not allowing their women to dress in this European way, and instead Muslim women have to veil themselves. Instead, Muslim women have to primarily be in the home domestic context. These were critiques that the colonizers used, European colonizers, to attack and colonize the Muslim world and also other indigenous populations within China, the Native Americans, the Aboriginals in Australia. This is where we find the first expressions of women's rights within the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And then only at the end of the 19th century were those kinds of discourses co-opted by the first wave feminists to discuss the place of women in European society, right? That's the actual historical progression. The first expression of women's rights was used by these men, European male colonizers.
Okay, I mean, we've clearly discussed the historical context of feminism and how that's been portrayed even by academics today. Just going into the manifestations of how feminism presents today in contemporary time, I just want to reflect on something, Sister Zara, that you mentioned, that you debated the feminist journalist and self-proclaimed political lesbian Julie Bindel, who stated that if she could, she would put all men into a camp with wardens where their female relatives could check them out like library books. And you talk about this concept of reverse sexism. But women cannot be sexist because they do not hold political, economic, and institutional power, as has been explained earlier by some of these feminists. Do you want to give us a bit of an idea about the idea of reverse sexism and this argument that women cannot be sexist because they do not hold political, economic, and institutional power?
Sure. And to sort of build on what's been discussed already, so to tie this in with the idea of patriarchy and the idea that men have held power in society to the detriment of women for a long time, and also just to connect with what was discussed earlier before going deeper into this question, there are a lot of parts of particularly Western history where we look at how women were treated, and we say it's, you know, from one perspective, it is easy for a group to look at that and say, yes, that women were oppressed. The fact is, in those periods, as in today's period, it's not necessarily a case of oppression, but rather ignorance. So where there is ignorance, rights of many groups of society will be denied. So, for example, when we talk about how before, you know, in Europe, women couldn't own property, whereas in Islam they could, the flip side of it is that in Europe, when, you know, particularly in England, when women couldn't own property, it also meant that they couldn't actually ever be taken to court or have any debts, because their husbands would be the ones that would have to be taken to court for any monies that the women owed, and if there were any legal repercussions for anything like that, the men would be the one that would have to face the brunt of it, not the women. So there are two sides to that, and there isn't that isn't to say that that is the right way for things to be at all. It's just to say that when this narrative is put together about how one group of society is hard done by, we have to be, and I think perhaps this is what Brother Daniel is suggesting, we have to scrutinize that for our own benefit. So we need to look at whatever these claims are, and we can even put history to side for the moment, and let's look at what we're dealing with today, what is really going on. When people do come to us with grievances, whether it's men saying that, you know, we want to earn a living for our families, but we can't because there's too much corruption or tyranny, you know, not because they want money so that they can go on a yoga retreat. You know, they want to be able to provide for their families. If they can't, you know, because of either, you know, in the Muslim world, because of discord, it's unsafe, there's too much corruption, you know, they're prevented from that. Oftentimes, you know, young boys are going out to earn to provide for, you know, very large families if their fathers are no longer around, because for whatever reason, you know, if because of war or, you know, all kinds of circumstance. And as a result, then obviously women's rights are also, you know, denied. Just to get to the heart of why we're having this discussion. So in Islam, a woman has, for example, the right to be provided for, but that's not going to happen if a husband can't get the work or is unable to actually earn because there's too much corruption in society. In Islam, you know, the woman, as does the man, they have, you know, she has a right to go out and seek an education, but she can't do that if the streets are unsafe because of, you know, because there is, you know, it's basically a battle zone. You know, in Islam, a woman has a great many number of rights, but they are hinged and connected with men's rights and with men's roles as well. So we have rights and duties to each other. And the problem arises is when we magnify on one group of society's rights, and we ignore the fact that we are interconnected in how we live and how we structure and how we achieve these rights at all. When we ignore the fact that one person's right only exists when another person has a duty to fulfill it, we're not answering the question. All we're doing is aggravating the sentiment or the feeling of dissatisfaction that people have. If we are just demanding rights, as it were, if we are just demanding rights and not talking about the infrastructure that is necessary to be put in place so that this domino effect of injustice doesn't occur, then again, we're not really answering the question. And in the West, I mean, as we mentioned earlier, this is manifested in a great many varieties of feminisms. So you have social feminism, ecofeminism, you know, intersectional feminism, and then you have slightly more radical feminisms, of which, per your question, Julie Bindel, you know, is is a member of that sort of camp of feminism. And so she had made this comment, which you mentioned, which is that if she could, she would put all men into a camp with wardens where their female relatives could check them out like library books. Now, of course, she said afterwards that, and she's not the first to make such outlandish statements, they're pretty common, particularly amongst, you know, the more, what they call themselves as radical feminists, but really it's kind of a slope and they all end up going in that direction at some point anyway. She did mention after that, you know, oh, she was only joking. But the point is that a man couldn't make the same joke. Now, if a man had said, for example, if he could, he would put all women into a camp with wardens where their male relatives could check them out like library books, and then afterwards said that he was only joking, he would be socially hung, drawn and quartered anyway. It wouldn't matter. Now, the reason this is interesting is because this brings up the question of something called reverse sexism. So often, feminists and other members of similar political ideology, you know, in identity politics sort of groups, they will say that there's no such thing as reverse sexism. And what they mean is that it's not possible for a woman to be sexist towards a man because men are not victims of something like a patriarchy. So they say that women, because they've been subject to, according to them, this sort of you know, this political, economic and institutional power, if women are prejudiced, it doesn't count as sexism because it doesn't change the status quo. This is what they would claim. Now, it's funny because, you know, sexism is sexism, discrimination is discrimination. And for Muslims in particular, you know, we live our lives trying to have the concept of accountability at the forefront of our minds. It's not that, oh, when is it okay to be discriminatory? When is it okay to be sexist? These types of conversations come up in, you know, in amongst, you know, in discussions amongst those who, you know, who subscribe to different identity politics. But for Muslims, this is something that we need to be very wary of. And this is why I decided to write about that. And the point here is that being a member, even if we want to, whatever the group is, whether it's racial oppression, whatever type of oppression it is, as a Muslim, being a member of an oppressed class, whether it's for wealth, race, gender, even if we want to go with that, whatever the reason is, as Muslims, it doesn't give us license to then inflict injustice against others or to assert superiority over members of what we perceive to be the oppressor class. So being, you know, if we are an individual in society where we're hard done by for whatever reason, it doesn't exempt us from our own life purpose as Muslims. It doesn't exempt us from our own duty as Muslims to do what we can for justice and for our own accountability, so that we don't have to answer for that. And it's put much better than me, obviously. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals in the Quran, for example, a very interesting conversation between a weak group, or a group that, you know, that is described as oppressed, and an overbearing group, or an oppressor group. And the weak group and the overbearing group have both been condemned in the hereafter, according to this passage. And the verses are in chapter 34, verses 31 to 32, and it goes as follows. Allah says in the Quran, "If you could see when the wrongdoers are made to stand before their Lord, refuting each other's words, those who were held weak will say to those who are overbearing, if not for you, we would have been believers. And those who are overbearing will say to those who are weak, did we avert you from guidance after it had come to you? Rather, you were criminals." So in other words, these two groups, they will wrangle with each other, they will argue with each other while standing before their creator. And the oppressed group will be trying to blame the oppressor, the overbearing group. And the oppressor will then turn around and remind the oppressed that, okay, you were oppressed, but you could still have followed divine guidance in your own behavior, saying, you know, we didn't make you do wrong just because we were doing wrong. And, you know, interestingly, the Quran describes both groups in this passage as wrongdoers. The word literally uses zalimun, which means, you know, oppressors. So this is something that is really important to flag, because sometimes when we are dealing with situations where we are talking about, you know, cases of what we would describe as injustice and how to you know, combat that, how to deal with that, how to address that. Sometimes people think it's okay to then reverse the discrimination that they have experienced in order to try to, quote unquote, level the playing field, or to say that, well, it happened to us, we're in such a weak position now that, you know, this won't ever cause any real harm. In effect, it's just venting. Well, this is not what, as Muslims, we are allowed to do. We have to make sure that we deal with things in the way that the Quran has described, and in a way that doesn't give rise to any kind of residual feelings of anger from the other side. So, for example, going back to, you know, the likes of Julie Bindel, etc., because feminism in the West has been so aggressive, and because it's at the core of its ideology, it ends up advocating for female privilege rather than to redress any perceived notions of injustice. Because of that, it's actually resulted in a counter movement in the West. So you have a lot of groups that describe themselves as men's rights activists. And even to some extremes, you have some amongst those who describe themselves as men going their own way, which means they want to live their lives without engaging with women at all, no marriage, nothing. So Islam doesn't want us to be swinging wildly on this pendulum. And when we feel that we can, you know, as the saying goes, when the oppressed becomes the oppressor, whether they're really oppressed, you know, we're not talking about that right now, but just in their own minds, if somebody is oppressed and they feel that they can then, you know, do the same in return, I mean, we have countless examples in our society of why this, when and why this goes wrong. Academics, philosophers, you know, Islamic philosophers and historians, Ibn Khaldun, so many people have noted that the oppressed often take on the guise of the oppressor because they think that that is what power looks like. They think that that is how to resolve their issues. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, no, you know, deal with things justly. When you encounter a problem, apply the solution that is measured, and not just for the sake of revenge, which often some feminist campaigns do end up resembling. So yeah, hopefully that's a bit of an explanation on how Islam answers the question, is it ever okay to be discriminatory? And the answer is no.
Okay, we've approached, well, we're approaching 5 o'clock here in UK, so from 5 o'clock onwards, we were hoping to get in a number of questions from the audience. What I will do is, some of these questions are in essence related to some of the questions I had put to yourself, or I was thinking of putting to yourselves from panel discussion. So I'll refer to one question, which is mainly for Danielle, and that is a question regarding feminist epistemology. So the question is, how would you respond to criticism from fellow Muslims that you discredit all said overlapping topics subscribing to feminist epistemology? So Daniel, I'll start off with you first. Sister Zara mentioned related to how modern feminists, Muslims, read the Holy Quran as an ink block text. So they have random ink splashes on a page and projecting their own desired meanings into it. So bringing those two topics together, I'll start off with you, Daniel, first. If you just give us a bit of insight to feminist epistemology.
Yeah, so feminist epistemology, I think, itself is very suspect in what it demands. And feminist epistemology is something that is used to criticize the Islamic tradition. It was used to criticize Christianity and the Christian tradition. And there's this idea that knowledge itself is gendered. So what does epistemology mean? Epistemology is the study of knowledge. What is knowledge? How do we know what we know? This is studied in the subject of epistemology, which is a philosophical topic, but in recent years, there is an entirely separate subtopic or subgenre of feminist epistemology. And what feminists claim is that knowledge itself is gendered, language is gendered, the way that we employ language and use concepts can inherently involve patriarchy and therefore be used as a system of oppression. And what they point out is that if we look at the Islamic tradition or the Christian tradition or any kind of past society, much of the knowledge was generated or discussed within schools and universities. We see men in a position of priority or prominence or majority vis-a-vis women, and that is suspect, because then we cannot trust the product of those institutions, of those male-dominated institutions, because they are speaking as men, and therefore they do not understand women's concerns, and they're in effect silencing women and disenfranchising women. And so this is the critique of feminist epistemology. And so what can Muslims say to this? As far as Islam is concerned, we can't accept this view for the very simple reason that our prophet, the prophet, peace be upon him, was a man, and all of revelation comes through him. The messenger was a man. And so if we are discrediting men as not being objective, or men not being able to convey truth, absolute objective truth, because of their gender, then we are discrediting all of Islam. We're discrediting the Quran itself, because the messenger himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was a man. And then the rest of the tradition as well, as I mentioned before, as a historical fact, we see men in the majority. So this is exactly why feminist epistemology is so dangerous if Muslims start going down that path and accepting its basic premise that knowledge can be gendered. And it's simply not the case. Like, how does truth have, how is truth affected by your anatomy or by your organs, like your reproductive organs? This is a very postmodernistic understanding of truth, and it denies the possibility of truth in its very essence. So we have to be very careful not to adopt such a postmodernist mindset that undermines our entire religion from its core. But we can, and then we can have an offensive attack against this feminist epistemology by saying that, well, if we can discredit certain kinds of knowledge because it's coming from a specific gender, well, couldn't we also say that race affects knowledge, so that we discredit certain kinds of knowledge because it's coming from a specific race? And so, I mean, some postmodernists do go to that extent and say, well, we have to reject all of scientific knowledge because it's mainly white Europeans who have produced this knowledge. Or we have to throw out all historical knowledge because it's mainly white Europeans who are producing or are curating this knowledge. But we can go further, because if it's a specific race, then what about specific ethnicity? What about a specific culture? Okay, why isn't race or why isn't knowledge specific to specific cultures? And so you're undermining the possibility of any kind of objective knowledge or any kind of objective discourse between people, because everyone is coming from a specific point of view, right? So this is the postmodernist premise, and it invalidates and nullifies the possibility of any kind of objective conversation that can be used, because everyone is coming from a specific point of view. So there's no objective knowledge. And that's the kind of nihilism that results from a feminist epistemology. And these are the implications of a feminist epistemology, that not all feminists acknowledge or recognize that it leads to this kind of nihilistic, anti-knowledge, anti-epistemology understanding about human beings, human existence, and our relationship to knowledge. We have to be aware of this, and as Muslims not fall into these traps and just wholesale accept what we read within gender studies or what different gender studies professors have been writing about for the past couple of decades.
Okay, Sister Zara, just going to you, and as previously I asked regarding how this projects in an understanding of the Holy Quran, for example, for somebody who has a feminist sort of mindset. In relation to that, I'll just put another question to you, which is also another panelist question, regarding the concept of female being naqis wal aql, and deficient in their intellect. Which is basically mentioned in some of the prophetic tradition. Now, in relation to that, there's also the issue regarding women, their testimony being worth half of men. Could you give us some kind of indication how Muslims could rephrase that in terms of in modern day context?
Well, first to sort of build on what was discussed just now by Brother Daniel, and in particularly how that epistemology, that feminist approach to this issue has been translated by Muslim feminists when dealing with the Quran and the Hadith and things like that. Now, whilst their primary claim has tended to be, you know, that there's too many male voices in Islamic scholarship. They often claim that, you know, that there's too many, the male voice, they say, has drowned out the female voice. In reality, when you look at their claims, it's really not to do with the male voice per se, but rather what those male voices are saying. So, for example, some of these, and I'll give you some examples, some of these Muslim feminists will quite readily employ and wave as flags some of these male voices if those male voices align with feminist ideas. So, for example, they will often cite the works of Qasim Amin, Tahir al-Haddad, Fazl al-Rahman, and Nasser Abu Zaid as being, and Zibamir Husseini, for example, describes some of these men as being the backbone of feminist scholarship in Islam, which is taking reformist thought onto new ground. So for them, it seems to be not just, it doesn't necessarily seem to be about eliminating male bias, although that's one way of looking at it, but rather for them, it's also about redacting many of the ideas that were carried by particular, you know, by our scholars, but also redacting a lot of the female voices that our Islamic history is rich with. So as for anybody that is not aware, for example, Sheikh Akram Nadwi has documented at least 8,000 female scholars in the hadith sciences alone. And we know that Aisha radiallahu anha was, you know, responsible for delivering to us a huge corpus of hadith narrations. So it's important to point out the female voice has not been, you know, subdued or quiet or even absent, even remotely absent in Islamic scholarship. Rather, it's been prominent. But it is almost as though, you know, a lot of these Muslim feminists would like us to forget that they exist. And following on from this, there are a number of, you know, of approaches that lead on from this. So, for example, Aisha Chowdhury, who, you know, a contemporary a Muslim feminist, openly advocates cherry picking, selectively taking hadith, arguing that because the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, she says that he is depicted as both a radical egalitarian man and a patriarchal man who belonged and was comfortable in 7th century Arabia. And because of that, we could choose, according to Aisha Chowdhury, which hadith to adopt and which to leave behind. And she says, for example, in doing that selectively to support a gender egalitarian vision of Islam, Muslim feminists would be doing exactly what Muslim scholars did when using prophetic practice to support patriarchal perspectives of Islam. And Keisha Ali also says something similar with regards to the hadith, you know, further, you know, they will say things like the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam they say that he did the best he could to create gender egalitarianism, but without fulfilling this vision in his lifetime. In other words, they imagine that they are here to complete the mission of prophecy that the Prophet ﷺ, according to them, you know, he didn't finish what he was supposed to be doing. And that's just with regards to the hadith. You know, there are others such as Amina Wadud, who has already been mentioned, and others who have built on her theories, Umayma Abu Bakr being one of them, who, you know, and Keisha Ali being another, that would say that, you know, you can reject even the Quranic text itself, according to these individuals, if it doesn't align with feminist values. So what are these values? If they're okay with certain male scholars but not others, what is it that differentiates whether they find this acceptable or not? And there are plenty more examples where, you know, they go on to admit it's not about even these Muslim feminists, so-called Muslim feminists themselves. They admit that Islam and feminism are not compatible. They admit that what their work is to try to reconcile between very different ideologies. So Asma Barlas, for example, she openly stated that her method of deciding, because she felt that she was in a position to do so, her method of deciding if the Quran's teaching were ethical and egalitarian, her method was to combine the Quran's view of egalitarianism and justice with feminist theories. And Ziba Mir Husseini was another one who said that, you know, Muslim reformist thinkers, in other words, those who are trying to change Islam, not understand Islam, but change it, she said that they have tried to reconcile what they thought to be fundamental principles in Muslim law with modernist conceptions of justice and gender relations. So they will openly admit it doesn't need people like even myself or Brother Daniel or Sister Fatima to say that they're contradictory, when Muslim feminists themselves are saying they are not compatible, and this is why our work is about reconciling the differences between them. I could go on with so many examples of that, but, you know, I think that's that is what is meant by you know, the idea that a modernist feminist Muslim would read the Quran as an ink blot test. So sometimes psychologists do what's called, or psychiatrists will do something called the Rorschach test. And many of you will be familiar if you see the images, because they're used in popular media a lot, where it's a blank screen or a blank piece of paper and it has a very symmetrical ink blot image on the page, and they ask you, you know, what do you see? And it seems that for some of these thinkers that I have mentioned, these so-called thinkers that I have mentioned, some of these reformists, the Quran for them is not as the Quran describes itself. The Quran says it is mubin, and it is clear, and it has, you know, it has some passages which are more poetic and which are more open to interpretation, but it has others which are longer, which are the legal and typically the Madani verses, which are very clear and very direct and very precise in their meaning. But for some of these modernist thinkers, they will look at these passages and say, well, what does it mean to me? And they will impute their own meaning to it. So this is one of the things that we need to be aware of when we look at, you know, the way that reformist thinkers, you know, such as some of the ones that I've mentioned, for them, the Quran is not a text that Allah has given us for our guidance. Rather, for them, it seems to be, what does this book prompt in you? Almost the way that we would read, you know, outright poetry. To come back to, you know, to your question with regards to some of the hadith about testimony, from what we can see, a lot of the times these differences between, so, you know, one female witness, one male witness is equivalent of two female witnesses. This is in a very specific situation. So in that particular scenario, that would be more typically to do with commercial transactions. And this is because at the time, you know, women were not prominent, or they were not, you know, that wasn't their main arena. the commercial world or the industrial world or the working world, it was obviously women did work, but it wasn't their primary arena. And so you would have, for example, if you had one male witness, you would have two female witnesses, because that was not typically the area of expertise. But similarly, if it was an area that women would typically have more expertise, you would not need two female witnesses. You would have one female witness and maybe two male witnesses if it was not an area where men could be expected to have an understanding or an expertise or a conversant knowledge. There are other scenarios, for example, in criminal law, because those which I have just mentioned are not to do with criminal law. For example, if a husband accuses his wife of something and she says, no, I did not, their testimonies would cancel each other out. His wouldn't be worth more just because he's a man. There are other situations in which you would need many male witnesses to equal one female witness, such as, for example, accusations of zina. You would need 4 male witnesses. You wouldn't need 4 women to testify that the woman had not whatever. It would just be her word, and you would have, a number of others. So oftentimes people bring that up because they think it is, it's one of those gorilla questions where, we have an understanding of these things, and because we have an understanding of these, we don't take these things as accusatory, but rather people think that they can be used to undermine or to show how Islam undermines women. But all of these things, they have a deep understanding, and, they were not used in isolation, it was part of a very sophisticated system that unfortunately we have become, to some extent, we have become archaeologists of what Islam is. We have lost touch with so much of what these rules and what these laws and what this culture is supposed to give us. And part of, what we need to be doing in the Muslim world as well as here is to revive that understanding. I mean, questions like what, this one would have been, a while ago, common knowledge for most Muslims. It wouldn't have even been a question. But we are at this point now where we are dealing with these things, and where we need to think about how do we not just answer these questions for the sake of curiosity or for the sake of combating a negative impression of Islam, but we need to know these answers so that we can start to rebuild our communities and our societies based on Islamic understanding and Islamic principles, not just to defend ourselves, which is what we are caught unfortunately in a cycle of doing, which is defending Islam, and we should be doing that, but we also need to be living it generally as well.
Okay, I'm going to open up the questions to all of you about the position of women as mentioned in what we call the Nasus, or the Holy Quran and the prophetic tradition. So there are other issues. For example, I mentioned one earlier on regarding the testimony of men relative to women. There are other sort of questions which relate to, for example, men are men more superior? Ar-rijalu qawwamuna 'ala an-nisa. So men are more superior, they have a higher position than women. Equality of men and women, does Islam have a different perspective? Sister Fatima, how would you respond to something like that?
Okay, I think that's a lot of those are a lot of topics, but I think if we look at it from this perspective, and if we keep returning to this perspective, and I know I've mentioned it before, that we have a creator. I think if we can always go back to that point, and the fact that if we believe in a creator, and we believe we believe he's not male nor female, right? He's above these human characteristics. He's neither male nor female. He created us. He sent us guidance. When he sends us guidance, that sometimes doesn't make sense to us because of the times or the conditioning that we've experienced in the society that we've grown up in. Okay, the very fact that we know that this is guidance from the Creator should lead us to saying to ourselves, there must be a wisdom behind this, right? So instead of going, you know, head over heels, trying to find and trying to reason it out for the current society, right? For me, there's nothing in the Quran and Sunnah that I could be presented with that is established from the Quran and Sunnah and consensus of, you know, our scholars, that would shake my faith or cause me to, you know, question the kind of the core beliefs of Islam. Because once I've accepted that this is God and he knows us better than we in our limited minds know ourselves, it becomes easy to actually say, oh, okay, Allah has said this should be the case, and so there's a wisdom in that. I might not be able to see the wisdom right now, but sooner or later Allah will either reveal it to me, or maybe he won't reveal it to me, but the very fact that I know that it's from Allah and from his messenger, that's enough for me to know that this thing is good for me. And I just want to bring it back to like looking at the way that, for example, feminists, if we realize that feminists are just human beings, right? They're just human beings. They've had their own conditioning, okay? They've grown up in a particular society in a particular way with a particular idea of what right and wrong is, justice is, and, you know, what women should be doing and men should be doing. One of the things that we notice is that even in our times, we're seeing some of the results, the negative results of some of the things that feminists campaigned for many, many years, okay? And what that highlights to us is that instead of following human beings and what they're telling us is, you know, the right way of living as women, we should follow the Creator, because they will always make mistakes. And I'll give you a few examples. I think Brother Daniel also mentioned some of these examples. So one of the examples is motherhood and the devaluing of motherhood that we've seen. You know, we're seeing the results of in our times. We're seeing mental health problems in young people skyrocket since feminists called for daycare centers to be established, you know, because they said that motherhood is not something special or unique to women. You know, anyone can look after a baby. They encouraged this culture of daycare centers where babies were literally looked after by strangers from morning till night. And now there are actually, you know, counter movements to those, to the negative effects of what they called for in their time, and books being written. You know, I've got a number of books on my bookshelves, for example, The Female Brain by Luann Bresendine, and there's a book called Why Gender Matters, and a book, I've forgotten the author, he's a scientist, and also by Steve Biddulph, who's a psychologist. He's written a book, Raising Babies, and all of these people and others are saying, actually, it was all wrong. Babies need their mothers more than anyone else. You know, there's no one in a baby's life that is actually more important than the mother, and the relationship between the mother and the child is unique, and it can't be replaced by just anybody else. That's just one example. Again, breastfeeding, for example, now, you know, the whole, when you walk into an antenatal clinic in the NHS, everywhere, you know, you're being told breast is best, because there was a movement by feminists to kind of tell women that, no, you know, you have your freedom, because obviously breastfeeding means women have to commit a lot of time and effort. And they kind of had a movement against breastfeeding, and now the government is having to, you know, flip that around and try and get women to breastfeed again, because of the harms that, or because of the benefits of breastfeeding that the child would be denied if so many women stop breastfeeding. And then again, women are seen as basically economic contributors and nothing else, you know. And I think that's why, you know, one of the things you did ask me before this webinar was about, you know, why is it that many feminists actually turn to Islam eventually and embrace Islam. And I have a number of friends who would have described themselves as feminists, and then they, when they discovered Islam, they embraced Islam. It's because women are looking for contentment. Women are looking for peace of mind. As human beings, we're looking for the right way to live our lives. And they may have been attracted to feminism initially, thinking that perhaps, you know, they'll find some of the answers to the things that they're finding difficulty in life. But ultimately, it didn't satisfy them, because it's not a holistic way of life, because it's not from the creator. Right, it's just the blind leading the blind, literally, you know, human beings leading other human beings to a way of life or to ideas that they think are the best ideas, but then later on finding actually maybe we might have been wrong about that. And I've given you some examples of that. So I think if a woman wants contentment, if she's dissatisfied with the system that she's under at the moment, which treats her as nothing more than an economic contributor, as a taxpayer, and actually, this might be a bit controversial, but you know, growing up in the UK, I actually believe that women have, from a very young age, been groomed, literally been groomed, to be more sexually exploitable than they would have been if they had been left on their fitra, and I've seen many examples of that. And we're seeing the results of that, you know, in our times, you know, some of the negative results of that. I think if women want to escape that and they want true contentment, and they're willing to, you know, submit to their creator, they will find in Islam the contentment that they seek. And yes, the creator does tell us that men and women are different. He tells us that men and women are not the same. We have equal value in his eyes, but we're not the same. We complement one another. We don't need to compete with one another. And I think those are like the, you know, the basic foundations. But every aspect of Islam that I know, that friends of mine who are feminists who became Muslim and who became religious Muslims, every aspect of Islam that sometimes initially they found difficult to understand. One of my friends recently said to me, you know, I couldn't understand why segregation, you know, when it came to men and women in segregation. And one of the beautiful things she said to me was that for the first time in my life, when I became a Muslim, I had real love and friendship with women, with other women. And, you know, I kind of explored that with her. And she said, you know, you don't realize what a sexually charged environment the average party is. You know, and she said she used to go to parties with her husband. And she said she would constantly be looking at who was talking to her husband. And, you know, there was this kind of understanding they had that you could flirt with one another, you could, you know, with other people, etc. But she said that whole toxic environment, and she called it a toxic environment, she said, I didn't know there was another way, you know, to have social relationships until I became a Muslim. And, you know, I enjoy my social relationships more now without that kind of toxic environment being there. So I think as Muslims, we should realize that Islam is a gem. Islam is a way of life that if people were to experience it and, you know, to understand it, they will benefit from it. It is them that will find peace of mind and contentment through it, you know, if only they would accept it.
Okay, Daniel, we'll finish on you. Same kind of question. You're a man. Are you more superior to women? And second question in relation to that is, should women be allowed into the masajid?
Okay, I don't know if I can answer both of those in the time given, but on the question of aql that was brought up further, I agree with a lot of what Sister Zara said, in that there are specific contexts that we have to consider. For example, testimony in the transmission of hadith, right? So the transmission of the deen was not considered half of that of a man. If a woman is transmitting hadith or teaching hadith, or you have women who are scholars, who are fuqaha, their transmission of knowledge is not considered to be half of that as men. That being said, I think this idea of aql and aql being different, such that men have more as opposed to women, I think that I don't see why we should really have a problem with that, and why we should not take the statement of the Prophet, peace be upon him, at face value. Because why is it really so hard to accept that men and women have different capacities? We recognize that when it comes to like anatomy, our bodies and physical features, men and women are different. Men are stronger physically on average. Yes, there are many women who are physically stronger than me, but when we're comparing two species or two categories, we have to use these kinds of general expressions. And the scholars recognize that when it comes to naqasat al-aql, that Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah says this, that there are many women who are superior to some men in terms of their knowledge, in terms of their reasoning abilities. But when we make a statement like that, comparing the sexes, comparing two categories, you have to use generic language, and you have to look at the averages, and you have to look at the spread in terms of IQ, or the spread in terms of certain analytical abilities. And so this is something that anthropology, biology, all recognize, okay, that there are differences in cognitive abilities, and when it comes to analytic capabilities, men on average tend to have it slightly higher, and also if you look at a bell curve, men are more on both extremes, and men on the very ends of the spectrum, several standard deviations greater than the average, you find much more men than women. So this is a fact about the genders, and I think that we should be able to recognize that without controversy, and take the statements of the Prophet ﷺ at face value. And the scholars of Islam historically have also taken that statement as face value, and they didn't try to sugarcoat it or try to appease this kind of unreasonable, irrational feminist claim that the sexes are exactly the same and that men and women have exactly the same capacities. That actually is something that is irrational, and that we should see with suspicion and hold in suspect. And also, another important study, many studies have shown that if you look at societies where that are considered to have the highest levels of gender egalitarianism and gender equality, such as the Nordic countries, right? They're considered, Sweden, Norway, Finland, are considered to have the highest levels of gender equality according to feminist definitions. Within those countries, far fewer women go into science, mathematics, and technology. And they just decide not to, something that is not interesting to them at the same level as it is to men. So you find these discrepancies between the sexes, and I think it's very clear to see why that's the case. Like, those are not necessarily subjects that women have the same interest in as much as men. And I don't see what is inherently problematic about recognizing these kinds of differences. It's not some patriarchy that is forcing women not to be in certain fields and disciplines. That's just the differences between the sexes. Just like you find more men interested in going into a military activity, more men voluntarily want to join the military force, more men go into physical labor, construction, and these other fields. Feminists don't point out that discrepancy. Feminists don't point out the fact that men are doing these kinds of dangerous or violent kinds of jobs and functions within society, because it's very obvious why men are just more inclined towards that kind of activity. And similarly with science and math. It's only if you consider science and mathematics and technology as this superior discipline or this superior subject that you would find a problem inherently with the fact that one sex is more inclined to it than the other. So I think we can easily, explain things like women's testimony being half of that of a man in certain contexts. This hadith on naqasat al-aql. But yeah, I think we have to look at the larger cosmological questions as well regarding the place of men versus women. And this is a big question, and it's something that I've written about, I'll continue to be writing about, because I don't think that modern Muslims have really addressed this issue in a satisfactory way that actually is true to what scholars of the past have said on this question of al-rijal muqawwamuna 'ala an-nisa, that men have a degree over women. What does this really amount to? When we read the tafsir, when we read the exegesis and what the scholars have said classically on this issue, they would talk about darajat, they would talk about superiority of one gender over the other. So what does this mean? How do we understand this without throwing the scholars and throwing the scholarship under the bus? Because it wasn't one, if it were just one scholar, if it was just Imam Ghazali or just Ibn Taymiyyah or Ibn Jawzi who made this claim about women versus men or women vis-a-vis men, then we could chalk it up to sexism, we could chalk it up to cultural misogyny. But when we see 1400 years and we see thousands of texts and thousands of scholars who are making the same kind or have the same kind of understanding about the relation between men and women, then we can't just brush it aside and say, oh, they were suffering from this systematic immorality, this systematic misunderstanding. Because if we claim that, then we're undermining, right? If all of the scholars of the past 1400 years were misogynists and had this hatred of women or had this systematic misunderstanding about the place of women, then how can we trust anything of what they have said in religion, right? And this is exactly why feminists argue, like feminists like Isha Ali, for example, or Aisha Chaudhry, that Sister Zara mentioned. They pinpoint these statements within the tafsir, they pinpoint these statements within the Torah and the text, and they say, look at how misogynistic these scholars were. And this is exactly why we have to disregard their scholarship, we have to throw their scholarship in the trash, and we need to create these reform efforts to reinterpret the Quran, to access the Quran with a new set of modern eyes to really understand what the Quran says. And what Tabari has said or Qurtubi has said in their tafsir, or what Imam al-Shafi has said in his fiqh, or Imam Ahmed has said in his fiqh, this is garbage. Okay, so that is the feminist project, and the way that when you read their books, okay, when you read these academic books coming from the different feminist Muslim feminist scholars, this is their strategy. And we don't have very good responses, or I haven't seen very good responses to this. And what I'd say is that, yes, we can look at what these scholars have said about the position of men versus women and darajat and the cosmology or the hierarchy of the sexes that is implicit and acknowledged within Islam, within the nusus, within the Quran and the Sunnah, because you mentioned the ayat, and there are ahadith, very well-known ahadith, and all the scholarship. We can point to them and we can explain that, look, this is not a moral superiority, because we know, as Allah has said explicitly, that what the most pious of you are the ones that are closest to God. And so that's not gendered. Men are not inherently closer to God. Men are not inherently more able to reach Allah and to be more pious. There is, as far as morality is concerned, there is no gender difference. And this is very explicit, and And you don't find any scholars classically who have said that, yes, men have souls and women don't have souls, or men have these abilities that women don't have. As far as attaining the pleasure of Allah and standing before Allah as a Muslim, men and women are equal. But does that mean that there's not other kinds of differences that point to this degree that men have over women and the hierarchy that men have over women? No, of course there are. The vast majority, or all the prophets, all the Anbiya, have been men, right? The final prophet was a man, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, okay? So this is something that is significant. Men are put in authority and responsibility over their families. And that means that they have the more responsibility, but they have been put in this position, and this is what the classical tafsir say, they've been put in this position because Allah has endowed them with these capabilities that women don't have. Does that mean that women are disadvantaged in the akhirah, in the hereafter, and that they will be punished, or that they will be in a position where they're held to a higher standard because they didn't have that kind of authority? No, that's not the case. Again, there's a complete egalitarianism when it comes to morality. But as far as the distinctions, other distinctions and hierarchies that Islam acknowledges, we find these in the nusus, and we have to have a way to explain them and talk about them without just, throwing the classical scholars under the bus, or just misinterpreting the actual text. And this is unfortunately why I find in a lot of the Muslim responses is that there's an attempt to minimize the explicit face value meaning of the text, and thereby throwing all the classical scholarship under the bus, because we're not willing to ask these important, larger questions and to critique and undermine the philosophies and ideologies, the feminist philosophies and ideologies that lead to these things being a problem, right? Because these kinds of questions about naqasatul aql, or the daraja of men over women, these questions weren't raised classically, and for 1400 years we don't find Muslim women asking these questions. Why is it only now that these issues are being brought to the fore? And I think the reason is obvious, is you have this ideology that is agitating and aggravating and trying to attack Islam, and Muslims are imbibing and internalizing these constructs of thought that are generating these issues and these questions and these problems and these conflicts and controversies. Whereas in the past, you didn't find that. And I think that is a rational person, even if you're not Muslim, we should be able to reflect, unless we think that the vast majority of Muslims throughout time were stupid. Okay, they are stupid, irrational, immoral. Okay, why weren't they asking what these feminists are proposing? Okay, and that's an indication for us that, okay, there's more going on here. We have to ask bigger questions, deeper questions, more profound questions, and really address the systems of thought that make Islam and the text of Islam and the scholarship of Islam look backwards and look immoral and anti-woman and anti-justice, anti-egalitarianism, and so forth. I think that's the line of critique that is actually going to be that will actually resolve these issues, as opposed to sugarcoating or avoiding the issue and not exactly addressing the issue. And we don't really have time. I would love to get into all of these questions, whether it be wadribuhunna, within that same ayah where Allah is mentioning about nushuz of a wife. Right? How do we really understand nushuz? How do we understand the fact that Allah gives authority to men over women? And I don't think that this is something that is impenetrable, that we can't understand. We just have to, of course, we accept what Allah says, and we accept the Quran, but I think there's also a very clear hikmah, and there's a very clear reasons why Allah has prescribe this this model of society and this model of the family, and it benefits women as much as it benefits men. And this is an entire discussion that we can get into, but I have explained this in different classes that I teach, How do we understand this verse of the Quran that seemingly is advocating the violent subjugation of women? How do we reconcile that with our understanding of justice and equality and so forth? I think it's easy to do without these kind of outlandish interpretations of what darab, what striking actually means. And so those are big issues that we have to address if we want to make it the point that Islam is a rational religion. Islam is a rational religion, that the wisdom of the Sharia is clear and has been understood by Muslims and non-Muslims throughout time. We have to revive that kind of understanding, and I'll end it with that.
Okay, we've reached the end of our webinar session, and first and foremost, I'd like to thank all our guest panelists. Jazakumullah khair for your time, for your precious time. And can I also make reference to the idea that there's much more that's been mentioned regarding these subjects on the websites and blogs of our panelists. So you can always make reference to some of the wonderful amounts of knowledge that's been placed on their websites and blogs. Jazakumullah khair again. Shukran jazeelan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.